Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. I have here today Paul VanderKlay, who I got to know a little while ago. I have something I want to read about him pulled up here, and he's a really interesting guy. So let me read what I have to say, and then we're going to talk about my favorite topic, poverty and charity, and our mutual experiences overseas. So here's what I've got. Paul VanderKlay has been making commentary videos on the phenomenon of Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. His insights have helped me understand why Peterson is resonating with so many guys my age. I started watching Paul's channel when I noticed that he frequently references C.S. Lewis, Neil Postman, and Reformed theology. He also served in the Dominican Republic with the poorest of the poor for 7 years or 6 years. I knew I had to learn more about this guy. Today, I have the pleasure of hosting Paul for a discussion on my YouTube channel. We'll be chatting about poverty and serving overseas, among other topics. And we are grateful that you're here watching. And Paul, how was that as an introduction?
That's probably better than I deserve.
Okay, so tell us, well, let me explain how I got to know you. So I've been following what's going on with Jordan Peterson, and I was having trouble knowing how I should think about it. I was like, this guy's so interesting. I find him fascinating. I don't know what he's saying, like at least 50% of the time, if not more. And then I see your video, and I think it was one of the videos that kind of went viral. I saw that one pop up in my news feed. I was like, a lot of people are watching this Paul. It's a 2-hour video. I put it on while I was in the car, and I just listened to the whole thing, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many points I'm resonating with this guy. So I was like, I want to know about Jordan Peterson. I want to know about what this guy thinks about his time overseas, and all of these different things are just coalescing together. And so, yeah, where do you come in?
Well, I spent 6.5 years in the Dominican Republic. That was right after seminary. I grew up. My father took what was a kind of a sandwich giveaway bread gospel ministry thing that Dutch immigrants were doing in Paterson, New Jersey. And he was called there to kind of transition that from just kind of a ministry to African Americans who had moved up from the South into Paterson, transition it from just kind of a handout ministry into a real church. And so he started that work in 1960. And so I was born right there in Paterson. And that was my growing up years. I remember, so then in college, I took a trip to visit the Sandinista Revolution when I was in college. And I remember one of the girls on the trip was, she said, I'm so excited, we're going to meet the poor. And I thought,
yeah, bring your cameras, everyone.
Yeah. Well, you can't find them. Where I grew up and when I grew up, I always just assumed that most of America was black because that was what was always around me. And most of America was poor because my sample was kind of Paterson. And so I've just always lived in this milieu. Obviously, as you grow up, you learn to, see my father's ministry through other lenses. And then I wound up going overseas. So I added a different kind of experience to that. And then when we came back to the States, I took this call to a church in Sacramento, which is different again because poverty in the East Coast is different from the West Coast. And so, and the first day I kind of came to the office here in Sacramento, there was a woman sitting in the middle of the parking lot with a suitcase. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And she had some mental illness problems and she was homeless at that point. She had a Mormon background. And so a feature of my 20 years at Living Stones has been working with the homeless, people with mental illness, but also in a tremendously diverse environment. So in Paterson, it was mostly African Americans in kind of a ghettoized situation. Time Magazine did a story on my neighborhood in 2003 saying it was probably the most integrated and diverse community in North America. So that's been my life.
Okay, and so you're a pastor now, and you stumbled across Jordan Peterson, and what was it that intrigued you about him?
Well, a lot of my interest in Peterson had to do with the dislocation of the world we see in the Bible with the world we live in a modernist scientific perspective. And so on one hand, I've always done work with the poor, but another part of me is, I'm a pastor, so I study the Bible and I preach, and I've been a blogger for a long time, and I like to think about those kinds of things. And so Peterson, for me, helped begin to answer the question, how can we understand this biblical world, which, as in my conversation with Jonathan Pajot, phenomenologically looks flat with a dome, but we all say we're on a rock orbiting the world. And then I meet people who are, nouveau flat earthers. I knew one young man who told me he, after becoming a Christian, decided to become a flat earther. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And compare that to people I knew in the Dominican Republic who really were flat earthers. I was traveling with one guy, and he asked me one day, we're just driving along the coast, beautiful island, says, I wonder what it's like where the ocean meets the sky.
Mm-hmm.
And it dawned on me
As
he wasn't being poetic.
Thought, yeah.
That's right. And I thought, okay. And so I've always had these worldview questions as well, and they do kind of connect up with the poverty personality things too. So I'm very high in openness, and so I always try to integrate all these pieces that don't really fit together. It's interesting and fun for me.
So for your viewers who have come over to this video, I'll give a little bit of background about me. I grew up in what Charles Murray would call a super zip. One of the wealthiest zip codes in the country. I went to a private school, went to a private college. I had all of my tuition paid for. I spent a year working at a corporate job, and I did very well at that, and also hated it. And so then I looked for another opportunity beyond that, and I found the opportunity to go and live in Malawi, Africa, which is often the poorest. It's in the bottom 5 poorest countries on the planet, and usually it's right at the very, very bottom. And so I spent 3 years living in Malawi, Africa, and I loved it, and I got to do a lot of poverty alleviation work, and I got to live amongst the poor. And it's literally like going from a super zip to one of the poorest countries on the planet. It's like a different planet. It's like a different universe. You just almost like this materialism that I'm drenched in here in the Northern Virginia is non-existent in Malawi, where people can barely afford a singular shirt with holes in it. They can barely afford 3 square meals a day, things like that. So yeah, I come from this. So I went from from a really affluent place to a really impoverished place, and now I'm back here in America working on a charity startup called DonorSee, and I'm back here, and we can talk about things like reverse culture shock and things like that. But yeah, that's my background.
That's really interesting. What made you have that career change? Why did you want to go to a very poor place of the world? I mean, what motivated you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was when I was in 9th grade, I think it was 9th grade, my parents took me to Kenya on like a safari, and that was my first time. Like, we got off the plane, and the taxi driver took us from the plane to the resort. And when we were driving there, it was like naked kids playing in the mud, and people living in shacks, and it was like I didn't know that existed, and I was just watching this, and I was like, who are all these people? What is going on? What is going on? Like, I don't understand this. And then and then the big resort doors open up. We drive inside, and there's like guys inside waiting with hot towels for us to wash our hands. And the doors close behind us, and I'm a pretty numbers-oriented guy. I spent a year teaching math in Malawi, and so I started doing the numbers about like how much a night at this resort costs versus how much people are living off of outside the walls. And the numbers were staggering, just like unfathomable that this is what is normal. And yeah. I like borderline ruined my family's vacation by pointing this out to them.
A grateful brat.
Yeah, I was like, you guys understand like the implications of what we're doing as a family? And so yeah, that was so I think, but that experience, 9th grade Kenya trip to go on a safari, I think stuck with me for a really long time. And I over throughout college and stuff, I would Like I was really intrigued when Coney 2012 happened, the Invisible Children stuff. I was really interested in Scott Harrison and the Charity Water story, stuff like that. So a lot of these things kind of were playing around in the back of my head and gave me this desire to go back to Africa sometime. And just being unhappy in my job was enough for me to think about making a significant change. So yeah,
what
but
was your job?
I was working as a manager for Enterprise Rent-A-Car. So it was a very customer service oriented job, and if you can imagine, and it was it was here in Northern Virginia, very affluent area. So if you can imagine grown men who are very wealthy acting like toddlers and demanding their way, that was my job was dealing with that.
I love it.
Yeah,
I love it.
It was a learning experience, right? I got a lot of business acumen from it, but that was about it. But you also spent some time overseas. So how did that happen? Why did you choose to go over? Or what was that whole experience like?
Well, I went through my first 4 years of college. I went through 4 years of college without declaring a major, which kind of frustrated my parents, who had hoped that I would graduate and do something. Well, I had to do 5 because I didn't declare a major till my 4th year. And I probably. So I look like my father. I sound like my father. I was always called Little Rev. And so I think part of me inside revolted against that. And my grandfather was a Christian Reformed minister. My father was a Christian Reformed minister. I wasn't going to do that. But the more I went through college, I was in engineering, I was in math, I was in history. And then, I thought what I really enjoy doing is theology. So I want to go to seminary and learn some more theology. And so then I was going to go out to the West Coast, actually go to Fuller. And then I met someone the woman who became my wife. And she was like, I really want to be a missionary. And so I thought, well, okay.
Why not?
I'll go to seminary and then we can be missionaries. And so she was a Spanish major, Spanish and religion major, and she wanted to go someplace Spanish speaking. We almost went to Brazil, which didn't make her happy, but then we didn't go to Brazil. And there was an opening in the Dominican Republic, so we went there. And to her frustration and disappointment, then we became pregnant and had kids. And so then she's, dealing with all of that, and I'm doing all the work, but I'm finding I'm really enjoying it. And, those years, I am far more indebted to the nationals and the missionaries where I taught. I can't believe I was worth anything to those poor people. I mean, what did I know?
Yeah.
But they taught me a ton about almost everything. And so I worked for about 6 years doing what was called church development. I worked with national pastors in what was a predominantly Haitian church denomination started by our denomination. Many of those pastors had been pastors in other denominations. And in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, boy, it gets complicated. There's with church work, there's kind of a donor-client relationship. And so pastors will sign up for whoever gives them the best deal. Mm-hmm. And so actually right before I got there was a pastor's strike. And this was strange because the pastors were basically striking against the mission. And for the mission, it was kind of like, what does that mean? Because the pastors kept doing their local work, which everybody loved, but the pastors stopped going to education meetings. And the pastor said, we want you to build houses for us. We want you to give us salaries. And the mission said, no, we're not going to do that. And so eventually the pastors, they came to some, they started working with the mission again, because what did the mission have to lose? But right away, that then just begins to highlight how enormously complicated even just trying to define the term poverty is, and especially how complex this is when, like in the island of Hispaniola, where you're just a boat ride away from Puerto Rico and you're just a short plane ride away from Miami. Mm-hmm. So right then and there, you begin to get into this enormously complex relationship where I would have Haitian pastors just come up to me and beg me and say, we're not a church without a missionary. I mean, you have to be the missionary. And I'm coming from Patterson, coming out of this civil rights background, where I remember getting to the country and we get into this guest house that the mission had. And here's this Dominican woman who is basically taking care of the house. She cooks, she cleans. And I'm having, as a young guy, I'm having all kinds of issues because I was raised with Dr. King and all of this stuff. So here I'm a white guy having this black woman, taking care of us in the house. And oh, I just didn't know what to do with it. But on the other hand, from her perspective, gosh, she's getting to live in this nice big house. All her food is paid for. She has a job. She moved in her daughter, her grandson. And it's just, and so then suddenly I just had to begin to say, okay, all of these relationships have to be understood contextually, and I need to figure out a bigger frame for them. And so that was just the beginning of my education.
So I think there's about 20 questions that came up and slipped away from me as you went through that. But I think one of the ways we can return to some of those questions is if you could talk about what was it like to spend that time there and then come back to America and be around people who probably could not understand your experience as much as you and the other missionaries you were with.
Well, part of what really brought that out, even before I came back to the States, was we had this practice of having work teams come down, and many of those work teams actually came from Canada. And it was interesting because, again, many of these had Dutch CRC backgrounds. The work teams from the U.S., they're kind of into the work, but they're kind of there for the tourism angle. The work teams from Canada, boy, they were going to build a church. But there's some craziness about that because you don't really need a bunch of relatively unskilled, unfit North Americans coming down to do, basic labor when you have this enormous pool of skilled, unemployed, contextual people to do it. And very quickly you figure out, no, the reason you have the work team down is because they're bringing down the money. And so then you're doing this tourism and this mission tourism, and the relationships and the conflicts, they just abound, and you begin to understand, one of the things that really, I think, looking back on it, was really hard on me emotionally was I came down there with the assumption that money and education could fix problems, and what I was forced to learn was they couldn't. And then when you come back to the States, you begin to realize, there's a lot more money here, and we don't have the same kinds of problems. But one of the things that kind of would irritate some of my friends who are, say, on the U.S. side and the community development people, they're like, we're going to go in and develop this community. And I would look at, say, a community that you just described, one that you live in, and say, you know what? What's really funny about the wealthiest, best heeled, best resourced communities in North America? As a pastor, I know behind those closed doors, there is drug use and alcoholism and misery and divorce and strife. In other words, the layers of poverty are real and consequential and crushing. You don't want to take that away, but just adding on education and power and money certainly helps some things and changes some things, but it isn't like we think. So then you come back to North America and you begin to realize sin is just, and that's, in terms of missing the mark, sin is just way too large for us to handle. And this is why I continue to be a Christian and a conservative Christian. Because, and I was just listening to Jordan Peterson on this interview he was doing today, and one of the things I think I was attracted to him by was he I think, unlike this illusion that I think dominates American culture, he recognizes that the problem with us isn't so much that different tribes don't have good answers. The problem with us is that we don't want to admit or sometimes even realize that all of these answers are insufficient. And they're even insufficient for us.
Okay, so yesterday you tweeted, or you mentioned somewhere, that in order to prepare for this conversation, people should reread chapter 4 of Jordan Peterson's most recent book.
Yeah, Rule 3. Yep.
Was it Rule 3 or Rule 4?
It was Rule 3, about helping people. Make friends with people who have your best interest at heart or something like that.
Okay, and how does that tie in with what you were just talking about?
When I read Rule 3 in Peterson's book, it forced me to confront things in my father's ministry. My father went down to Patterson to save Patterson. And my father did a lot of wonderful things and helped a ton of people and was greatly loved by it. But you always have to back up and ask yourself, what's my motivation for doing this? And especially when you work in a community like the Dominican Republic, or even, a poor neighborhood in North America, why do you want to do this? It's really weird in a context of a church context or a context of people who want to help the poor, that in an ironic way, you actually build your own self-righteousness and increase your own status at the expense of the poor people that you're not really equipped to actually help.
Those are some strong words, which I appreciate.
Well, it's true. And I see that, so for a while I was, right outside my door here, literally, I had a man who, he was bipolar. He was a serious alcoholic, had serious drug problems, was hep 3 positive. I mean, he literally, I couldn't get him away from my door for about 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so just in an exacerbation, I would come and the entire walkway was filled with garbage because he would pick garbage in the neighborhood, bring it here, try and strip out metals and just leave all the trash around. And so I developed a friendship and we had a good relationship, and it was Lazarus and the rich man, and I was the rich man. And you know how that story goes in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And so I would just get exacerbated. I would just get I would just get so frustrated with him. I just began taking pictures of the big piles of junk, and I started putting them on Facebook. And then I began to realize that everyone on Facebook was fascinated by his story. And so on one hand, I would tell his story to people, but on the other hand, in the back of my mind, feeling, am I using him? Mm-hmm. Because sure is nice getting all this attention, being the loving pastor who puts up with this crazy homeless man. And so in what ways wasn't I deriving my righteousness at the expense of this poor person? And this dynamic is endemic in any altruistic mission. And so on one hand, you're caught in a bind because you still have to do this mission. I mean, I wouldn't want to tell you, hey, this donor C thing, just knock it out and go back to enterprise. I'd never want to tell you that. I want to encourage you to do this because you are helping people, but it's not so easy. And it's not even not so easy in terms of how much you're able to help them, but it's even not so easy in terms of what this does in our own hearts. And so this is where, for me as a pastor, looking at Jesus' ministry, I mean, at some point you have to ask, well, what did Jesus get out of this? And some people might say, well, Jesus got, he's the most famous person in all the world. He's the most influential person in all the world. And I'd say, yeah, but he'd have to die naked on a cross, abandoned by his friends to get there. And you'd actually have to believe that the death itself is worth it. In other words, it's really a lot of fun to be seen as helping the poor, because Jesus has so deeply impacted our society. Back in Jesus' day, that wasn't an issue. Anyone who helped the poor, yeah, you'd have to be religious, which many people were, to imagine that, well, you help the poor and then God will help you back. So then you have to ask the motivational question, which is the question of the book of Job. Am I helping the poor because it's actually generosity? Or am I helping the poor because I am, trying to score points with God? Mm-hmm. Well,
this is something I blogged about on I think yesterday or the day before. I posted something called a post called the Charity Reformation, and I was a similar dynamic where in the charity sector right now, it seems like the people who have preeminence in terms of their interests are the donors and the charity itself, right? So if you want to talk about education in the charity sector, the way that you get a school built is you put a rich donor's name on a building, and you infuse the charity with enough extra revenue to sustain itself. As far as whether or not that building will actually effectively educate kids or help the people in a way that truly matters, well, that's usually a secondary thing, and there's a lot of unfortunately, there's a lot of examples of charities that have just like empty school buildings, and they're just putting plaques in different places because they need the revenue to survive, and they can't really report on how poorly their implementation is, because if they do that, then they won't be able to get donors, and if they can't get donors, then they can't execute on their mission, and their mission is so important that these like hiccups in the meantime are just worth it. And so one of the things I've talked about is I think when we're thinking about things like poverty alleviation, how can we return the primacy of the interests of the poor? How can we give if we're going to help people, if we're going to send someone a goat or whatever, how can we do it in a way that actually puts the poor's interest first, beyond just the donor and the charity?
That's right. And this is an old issue. So, for example, let's look at governmental programs to help the poor in the United States. Let's say that the government wants to do an education program. Great. And so the government's going to appropriate how many millions of dollars to this education program? Great. So then the question is, where's that money actually going to go? Well, most of the money is actually going to go to moderately educated, middle-class people who are running the program. So then you say, well, what we should do then is just give the money directly to the people, which is on one hand crazy, not that crazy, but if you actually do it, you wind up saying, well, yeah, it was crazy. and all of this just, to me, always demonstrates just how hard this is. There was a situation where, so I was living in Barahona, a little town in the Dominican Republic, and working my mission with my organization and stuff. And there were a group of people who were just independently connected with a pastor. And they had come down with mercy ships, and they had met this guy, and he was running an orphanage. And so then they contacted me, and they said, can you kind of check up, because we're having trouble communicating with this guy? I said, okay. So I'm going to go check out his orphanage. And so I go to the orphanage, and he's got a feeding center. Okay, so I go there, and there's nobody there. And I said, well, where are the orphans? Well, they're living at home. Well, what do you mean they're living at home? They're living at home with their parents. Oh, okay. In other words, by orphan, you mean children. All right.
Yeah.
And you're not feeding anybody at your feeding center. Why not? Well, because we're not feeding anybody today, because they only show up when we're feeding people. Oh, okay. So I report this back to the people in Canada. I say, you got to understand something here, that this guy, you are the goose that laid the golden egg for this guy. Okay. And, and they're like, yeah. And we just want better reports from him. I said, yeah, that's probably not going to happen. And I said, this is the deal. What's going on? And in the long run, and they're saying, yeah, but he wants us to buy a farm so we can have food to feed the kids, and buy a truck to get the food from the farm to feed the kids, and build a house at the farm so that, he can make sure nobody steals the crops. And, from a Dominican point of view, this guy is building his empire.
Yeah.
And I explained it to the donors, and the donors basically said, yeah, we can see that, but we still want to help him.
Right.
At that point, it's kind of like, okay.
Yeah. So I could not agree more with like this really troublesome dynamic where it's hard to help people effectively, or sometimes nearly impossible. And there's so many different things. Like I just read chapter 4 of Jordan Peterson's book, and it talks about the how we focus on certain things, like the basketball that's being passed back and forth. Yeah. So there's this experiment that was done where they tell people count the bounce passes. So there's 2 basketball players, and they're passing the basketball back and forth, and the person's counting. And during the experiment, a gorilla comes in, beats its chest, and walks out. And the people watching the basketballs don't notice it. They're just so focused on this one thing that they don't notice it. And so I think I was reading that, and I was thinking, man, this probably plays heavily into a lot of poverty alleviation work gone wrong. People focusing on a singular issue, not realizing a broader context, and trying to execute on aid in a way that just totally misses the bigger picture.
Right. No, that's right. And you see it all the time. But at the same time, people listen to this and say, well, then we shouldn't do anything. Well, you
So
can't
that's
do that
what I
either.
want to get at. That's exactly what I want to talk about, because this whole time it's like, you're right. There are massive hurdles and obstacles, and poor people are going to be, the poor will always be with us. So what's our responsibility? If it's hard to help and we'll probably mess it up, what do we do? Because we're the people with 10 talents. So what do we do?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think we do what we're doing, which is we try to do, which is that we keep working at it. Now, one of the things so I'm a Calvinist, and one of our documents in our denomination is the Heidelberg Catechism. And the Heidelberg Catechism is structured around 3 words: misery, deliverance, gratitude. And for me, that structure helps me keep my head with this, because number one, again, this gets into some Jordan Peterson stuff. I'm miserable, you're miserable, she's miserable, I'm oppressed, we're all oppressed, we're all in this muck together.
Yeah, it's a state of being.
It's a state of being. That's exactly right. Deliverance, again, as a Christian, I say, okay, grace means that Christ, out of the generosity of his heart, out of no necessity, comes to the world to save us. Now, what's ironic about the ministry of Jesus Christ is that, in the Galilee, he's healing all kinds of people. And one of the things that occurred to me early on when I read that was, if he had just come down and said, hey, why don't we get together here? And I'm going to show you how to take mold and develop penicillin. Mm-hmm. If Jesus had given them penicillin instead of healing lots of people, wouldn't that have been better? Now, think about that for a while. And if you think about that for a while, you begin to realize what Jesus encountered in his ministry, in his healing, multiplying loaves and fishes, and all of that ministry is what people who want to help the world encounter. All of those dynamics are there. And so we have to figure out, in some sense, how to embody Christ. And that's really tricky, because just as I described before, it's really you can get into a Messiah complex, and this can get messed up really easily, which is why it's misery, deliverance, gratitude. That finally our motivation needs to be, I don't know if I can save anyone. I don't know if I can help anyone. I don't know what earthly good will come out of this, but because Christ did this for me, I'm going to do this for this other person. And so then you wind up first trying to do no harm. Mm-hmm. and trying to what's that?
Not easy to do when you're actually when you're actually trying to help people. Like, it's really hard to not also hurt them.
That's right.
In these impoverished
and so for this guy
they live in such different cultures. Anyways, go ahead.
No, exactly. And so this guy who lived on my door, it's like, okay, I'm, if he's hungry, I feed him. And then the neighbors around the church are really frustrated because he's not only a nuisance to me, he's a nuisance to the whole neighborhood. Yeah. And they're like, if you wouldn't feed the guy, he wouldn't be here. Yeah. At what level is feeding this alcoholic enabling him? At the same time, well, first of all, he's not going to die of starvation here in America because he's dumpster diving at the supermarket. And second of all, I'm going to take those risks I'm going to take those enabling risks. I'm going to take those other risks that are involved in trying to help people, those dependency risks.
One of the risks that, sorry, go ahead.
No, exactly right. I mean, in what way was Daniel dependent on me? So, yeah, okay, I'm not going to give you cash. Every now and then I would give him cash, because sometimes he's just going through, withdrawal basically from alcohol so hard, a beer can settle him down. And so I'll buy him a beer. And why are you buying an alcoholic beer? That's just against all the rules. But mm-hmm. this is what you descend into when you try to help someone. And are you helping? Are you hurting? You're never going to fully answer all those questions, but you are actually to be the rich man and just walk over Lazarus completely oblivious is also not an option. So the best things you can do are try and learn all the things we have tried to learn, try to practice what our Lord has told us to do. At the same time, and so what my burden finally is, not in order to save myself, that's important in terms of my own motivation, but out of gratitude to help this person that's sleeping at my door. What my burden finally is to love him. And that suddenly transforms it, because let's say fixing his alcoholism, fixing his mental illness, fixing his homelessness, these are not things I'm capable of fixing. What I need to do is love him, which means that sometimes I will give him a beer and sometimes I won't, which means, wading into this unsolvable problem and probably never fixing it, which is also why I remain a religious person.
Yeah.
Who believes in things like the second coming of Jesus Christ, because I got no better answer. So and for whatever, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, there's a couple of things you've brought up the example of Jesus, and there's a few things in his life that I think about a lot, and I wonder if it's worth bringing up now. So one of the things is, he, like you said, he's around sick people. He could have invented penicillin, but there's plenty of times where he's like healing people, and then he leaves and goes and rests or does other things, and there's probably still sick people there that he's just leaving to be sick.
That's right.
And then the other thing I've thought about that's been pointed out to me before is his first miracle, the wedding at Cana. He turns the people, it's at the end of the wedding, people are probably already blitzed, like they're probably already drunk, and he gives them, like, drunk people at a wedding, he gives them more nice alcohol. And at least that's like that seems like the most likely situation given like the context of what was going on. And so I look at that and I say, well, there's a few lessons to be learned there. One of them is, okay, so Jesus' grace is like overflowing, like he gives abundantly, and also like recklessly. I don't know. What do you think about that? I think about this a lot because I think his example is worth following and understanding, but also controversial.
Well, I think the best way to understand the miracles of Jesus is that while in fact he is feeding and healing people, the message of the goal of the miracles are the message, not so much the outcome. And I think that's really important and helpful when you think about, even what we do in terms of working with the poor today. Now, the difficulty we have is that we live in a secular frame. And what a secular frame does is says that the only outcomes that we can publicly acknowledge or publicly value are outcomes within the frame. And the difficulty with Jesus is that all of his miracles point to something outside the frame.
So when you say
they point to him.
When you say in the frame, you're talking about things like material outcomes. That's right. Like lifting people literally out of poverty, giving people bread and so forth. That's and then when you're talking about things outside of the form, that's gospel.
Exactly. And that's where you begin to realize that someone living in your zip code in Washington, D.C., and someone living in a Batey run by, the government sugarcane organization in the Dominican Republic, who's illegal, who can be deported at any minute, who can be separated by their family, or someone who's living in Malawi, which is probably steps down from Haiti.
Yeah.
That they're in some ways, these two people are living in two different worlds, and in other ways they're not. And so then suddenly Jesus comes along and says things like, "Blessed are the poor." And you can look at Matthew's version, or you can look at Luke's version. If you look at Luke's version, the Sermon on the Plain, you have "Blessed are the poor," and he doesn't say in spirit. He just says the poor. Now, there's some of that meaning that transfers. But then Jesus has, 4 couplets that mirror them. And he says, "Woe to you who are rich." And you begin to say, now wait a minute. What does this do to my anti-poverty organization? Well, it should begin to explain to us that there are many different ways of being poor, not just the material kind. And that isn't to diminish the grinding nature of the material kind, because you can't read the Bible and simply dismiss that. It is not an Eastern document that says materiality is illusory. The Bible takes poverty very seriously. And in the Bible, throughout the Old and New Testament, God takes oppression and discrimination and poverty very seriously, and in fact says he will judge it eternally. Well, that's pretty big. At the same time, why is, again, the book of Job is really helpful here, because it's not just about the stuff. And I think in our secular framework, this is why I think in some ways poverty is, for our secular framework, a testimony to another world. And this is why this is why, let's say, if you had infinite resources, infinite power, you will not solve poverty in this world. Because, for example, so my friend who slept at the door loved to buy lottery tickets, and sometimes he'd win $100 or $200. Well, what would happen if he won a few $1,000,000? Well, it would kill him.
Yeah,
I mean,
I know.
It would kill him. And so, okay, so what? And people would always drop off shoes for him. And he'd come to me, they'd always drop off shoes for him because he was always barefoot. And people drive by and see him barefoot. He says, "Why does everyone give me shoes?" I'd say, "That's because you're barefoot. I like being barefoot." But, you know, everybody gave him shoes.
Yeah, well, I mean, that reminds me of, there's a whole nother dynamic there of giving people things that they don't need to make yourself feel good. And you see that a lot with like Tom's shoes, for example. In fact, when I was in Malawi, I saw a full warehouse full of Tom's shoes that had been airdropped and were never going to be distributed anywhere. They were just in this warehouse, and that's where those shoes ended up. But okay, so we've talked about poverty, and there's that. But then the other thing that I think about a lot, especially with my position, with your position, is when you look at our lives compared to the rest of the world, compared to the Haitians living in the DR illegally, and then the Malawians living in dirt poor shacks, we're like way, 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 way up at the top. And
way up at the
top. Like top 1%. And for anyone who's watching and doesn't know this stat, it's something like if you make $34,000 a year, you're in the global 1%. And so you are richer than 99% of the world. And not only that, it's not like there's a linear digression to the bottom. There's a very steep exponential digression, which means if you make like $700 a year, you're wealthier than the bottom 50% of the world. So you're very well off in this where you and I are. Okay. And there's poverty, and it's complicated. What do we do with this this position, this wealth that we've been, I don't know, born into or endowed with or happened into? What do we do with it? How do we deal with it? How do we deal with this position that we're in?
Oh, I think Jesus says it directly. He says, "Pour your life out." Well, what does that mean?
Yeah, what does it mean for a rich person to pour their life out? Yeah.
Well, and that's, so every rich person is going to have to figure that out for themselves. But the heart of it is doing it. And we live in a culture that, so the Heidelberg Catechism begins with the statement, what is your only comfort in life and in death? Oh, well, Southern comfort.
Yeah.
YouTube. Porn.
Yeah.
A nice house by the beach. And so what is your only comfort in life and in death? And that I am not my own. What does that mean? That means that your only comfort is that you don't belong to you. Well, if you don't belong to you, who do you belong to? That I am not my own, but belong body and soul and life and in death to my faithful Savior Jesus Christ, who has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood. Okay, what does that mean? Well, and so then as a Christian, you say, well, what should you do? You should pour your life out. Well, what does that look like? Well, it might mean maybe you're gifted in making money. So, hey, make money, try and find ways to give it away. Maybe you're gifted in terms of working with people, work with people. And throughout the history of the Christian church, this is what Christians have done. And so, but you're going to have to find your own way to do it in the middle of this huge, complicated world.
But do you think that there's a particular, it's particularly difficult when it comes to money, right? Someone who might be born into poverty, but they're really skilled at education, maybe, it'd be easier for them to pour out their gifts of education throughout their life. But someone born into money and who's good at making money, do you think there's something about money that makes it more difficult for them to dispense with that gift?
Think about this. The Bible doesn't always, if you would ask a Christian, What are the, if you had to turn the Bible into dualism, what would it be? They'd say good and evil, or God and Satan. Read the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says there's two masters. What are they? God and mammon. Stuff. That's the other master. And it's like, oh, not Satan, not myself, not the world. No, mammon. And so, I mean, I've even heard secular people say things like, you know, if you want to have power over money, you have to give it away. If you can't give your money away, you don't have power over it. It has power over you. And this, I think, is part of this, I think, gives us a window into the kind of poverty we see in the wealthiest zip codes in the world. You say, well, who is ruling that zip code? Well, it's money. Well, okay, so who is ruling the zip code of the, let's say, the beauty industry? Well, it's attraction. And this is where you get into the idea in the New Testament of principalities and powers that, or Bob Dylan, you got to serve somebody. And so everybody is serving somebody and everybody is living life. I mean, the people who decide to, you know, go and do eat, pray, love and go to Bali or something, what are they serving? You're all going to serve someone. And so here's the crazy thing about Christianity, which is you're going to serve a God. Now, all religions have you serving gods, but in Christianity, you serve a God who came and became vulnerable to everything that a minor oppressed, kingdom in the middle of the Roman Empire was, and gave himself in a way that even his friends couldn't understand. That's who you're serving. Oh, and he says that the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is who? The servant of all. So to me, again, it boils down to, well, what's your motivation? And why are you going to do it? And even if you start doing it, like, you know, in my family, generationally, we've been doing this, you still don't escape the, well, are we doing this because we want to look good? Are we doing this because we want adoring church people who are like, well, I can't do it, so I feel good letting VanderKlay do it. Yeah. And I feel good letting them let me do it. So I don't know. These questions all come back around to the same places for me.
Yeah, this is where I'm constantly like asking myself, because so there was the year after I graduated, I didn't have Facebook. I didn't have it the first year I was in Malawi. So that's 2 years without Facebook or social media. Happiest 2 years of my life. And then I got it back because I was living overseas and I was seeing all of these things and I wanted to communicate them back to people overseas. And someone donated a camera to me, a really nice DSLR camera, and I started making videos. And I really wanted to show the stuff that was going on over there. And I used the camera to start to crowdfund, and I did a whole bunch of cool stuff. And now I'm like full-blown addicted to my phone, full-blown addicted to screens and social media and things like that, and all of the reinforcement loops that bring me back. It's like I'm in it. I'm in the cycle or whatever, and it would be really hard for me to get out of it. And it's not necessarily, I don't want to be here, and I would love to like wrench myself out of it, but I'm so intertwined because it's necessary to my to this startup that I'm doing and to the work I'm doing with serving the poor. And so it's really messy and challenging. And I suppose I'm pretty much just venting to you about this dynamic. Yeah.
This is the human condition. There was a guy when I was in seminary, this was in the 80s. There's a guy named Viv Grigg. I still have his book over here. Servants Among the Poor. And Viv Grigg decided, you know, unlike the way I did in many ways, the Dominican Republic, I lived in what was, you know, a decent home. In fact, probably a better home than I grew up in the Dominican Republic. It's like, how does that work? Well, it's the same dynamic you just talked about. Well, he decided I'm going to go live amongst the poor. And so he, he lived among, in the Philippines.
Yeah,
that's right. He lived as they did, all of this stuff. And boy, as a seminary student, I was just so moved by this, and I want to do this. I want to do this. And our missions prof, who had been a missionary, kind of said, yeah, you know, that's right. And that's good. But keep thinking about it. And so I did keep thinking about it. And here's the funny thing that, so Viv Grigg, yeah, he got sick when everyone got sick because he was drinking the water, but hey, didn't grow up drinking that water. So, that's not the same. And then, let's say there's a coup or something in the country that he's living in. Well, what does he have that nobody else has? A passport. Mm-hmm. And what's he doing showing up at my seminary in Western Michigan talking to us? Nobody in that village is doing that. Yeah. So in some ways, that grand effort to go be amongst the poor is noble and vital. And I wouldn't necessarily want to discourage someone from doing it. But at the same time, there's no easy way out of any of these issues. They will always be there, this is the question you keep bringing me back to. So then what do? Well, you keep doing it. It's like, I do weddings for people and nobody should ever ask me to do their wedding, and people keep doing it because I give these wedding messages that just leave so many of the people just with their jaws dropped, because I tell them, you're standing here promising your undying love to this person, but odds are 2 or 3 years from now, you will hate them more than just about anybody else in the world.
Yikes. Yeah. It's not lovey-dovey.
No, Pastor, you shouldn't say these things. Oh, but they're true. But here's the other thing, that if you, in fact, so now you're in love, pretty soon you're going to be their enemy. Keep working through that. Yeah. Because if you can get to the other side, you might actually be useful and helpful to someone other than yourself. And that's exactly the same with all of these efforts and I'm sure you're realizing it too. Oh, I'm gonna help do some good in the world. Wonderful. Keep working at it and try along the way to pay attention to the ways that you're being self-serving, to the ways that you're not really helping anyone, to the ways that you're ironically perpetuating the problems that you're trying to defeat. Mm-hmm. You're going to find all of this stuff, but don't give up, which is for me why it's important that these actions flow out of gratitude and not duty or some kind of trying to save myself or save the world. Because if you go into it with that mentality, you will be crushed, because you're not God. You can't save this world. You might, if you manage to help somebody, God bless you. But yeah, that's the gig.
So last year, 2017, I spent a lot of time. I wrote a blog about this. I wrote a blog called "Mistakes I'm Glad I Made in 2017," and there were plenty of them. It was an easy blog to write, and one of the things that happened was I realized in retrospect I really like chasing after big opportunities, like big jumps, and I had several of them last year in 2017. Like Kevin Williamson wrote an article about my organization, which was really nice, and I was invited to a really you could say high-profile conference called The Gathering. I was invited to be a panelist there, and I was shaking hands with senators and having dinner with all sorts of cool people. So I had a bunch of these like big jumps, and in retrospect, at the time, they felt like mountaintop experiences. In retrospect, they were fine, but the jumps always settled right back down to where barely different than where I was before. And I realized that I probably had like 3 or 4 big jumps in the last year, and I wasted the 90% of the year by pursuing big jumps instead of just going after like a kind of a daily improvement. And so when I think about how to help the poor and do my best to serve people, even though it's really complicated, I just think, well, the best I can do is my best, and my best is focusing on like really small, achievable things on a daily basis, which is something that I think probably came into my mind from watching Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, and one of my favorite examples of this is C.S. Lewis. And you'll see from my channel, I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. A lot of things that it's only some recent biographers have come out with is that he spent a lot of his life, which wasn't that long, picking up the stools and vomits of a woman that he began an illicit relationship with but then took care of for the rest of his life, instead of in some ways doing what everyone would imagine he should do with this incredible talent.
Mm-hmm.
And this is again where I connect in with what Jesus says, which is in that, if you want to help the poor, why don't you start by helping? First start with love. First start with loving the people around you that you share the household with. Because if you actually try doing that, you'll learn what a jerk you are. Mm-hmm. And then if you're not a jerk, you'll learn how self-interested you are and congratulating yourself for not being a jerk. And then find someone and then find someone else that you can help near you. You don't have to do a big grand gesture, because what you begin to realize, just like you described, when you get connected with these things that the world looks at and says, ooh, ah, they're just different games. Mm-hmm. and this for me, again, is why, again, I'm a Christian, because I believe God sees this. And what Jesus says, for example, with the widow's mite, that he and the disciples are watching all these people, well-heeled people, give big donations. And this widow comes and gives 2 pennies. And Jesus says, she gave more. Mm-hmm. And what's implicit in that is that God saw her gift. So, for example, in C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, there's this scene where there's this parade in heaven of this woman who's just glorious. And so the person asks George MacDonald, who's his guide, says, who is this woman? He says, this is so-and-so who lived in this little place and nobody ever knew her, but she is a great saint.
Yeah, I love that.
Well, this is God's economy. And so really in my, again, even when I think about the guy who used to live by my door and is now in jail because he attacked a member of my church, which again, I mean, these things don't go
yeah.
away.
Right.
But and there are days when I was sitting here and he'd sit there and he'd talk to me, and many days what he really wanted from me was to just come into my office and have 20 minutes to share his stuff. A lot of it was rambling, but he just needed some other human being to look him in the eye and treat him like a human being, because nobody else in this world would, except when he'd come into church, and other people in church would too. But, probably the greatest thing I ever did for him was that. Mm-hmm. But who would know and who would care? Because he's in jail now. He's going to be in jail for a number of years for attacking this guy.
Right. The whole "what does it matter" conversation is
exactly.
And the thing is, you can expand that out. Even like you talk about that little act. Even if you look at someone like Scott Harrison, who ends up helping millions of people, hundreds of millions of people get clean water. Even someone like him, he's like in a just looking at the finite reality in which we live in and the ultimate heat death of the universe. Like, you could still kind of extrapolate out from that. Oh, this actually is not that meaningful. Even the really big gestures might not actually mean anything unless they're done with the right intentions and the right motivations, which is something only God can see. But I do want to ask you, because I think about this every single day, that I agree. Okay, it's the stuff that we do in secret that God cares about and watches, and that stuff is really important. And the widow who gives their 2 mites, I mean, that's like a really beautiful thing, and that's why I think. I mean, sometime we'll have to do a whole nother live stream on my frustration with the Christian, with pop Christianity, and how it's all these people who have really cushy lives and great book deals, and no one who has who's really suffering or sacrificing. Those are the people I want to learn from. But anyways, yeah, where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so I want to. One of the things I think about a lot is, so I agree that it's the stuff that's done in secret that no one sees that's important. And and you should check your motivations. At the same time, do you think that, given the position that we've been born into, the global 1%, and given the position of a lot of other people in the world, after we've taken care of our family, after we love all those people, do you think we have a special obligation to these people who have a fraction of what we have? Do you think there's something to that?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I mean, none of what I said wants to take away from that. The fact here's the crazy thing. So again, I was listening to Peterson on this Russell Brand interview, which was outstandingly good. Peterson makes the comment, I think he's dead right. And C.S. Lewis makes the exact same comment that if you look at nature, the world is set to be abhorrently unequal. And in fact, things seem to go this way. If you look at Peterson and his Pareto distribution, and when he explains all that, and you see this in terms of money,
fascinating.
And he makes the comment, and he's dead on right with this, that the only things that seem to bring equality is usually destruction. And so, first of all, it's in the self-interest of the wealthy to not let things get too out of whack.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that they can't see that is probably testimony to their blindness in some ways and how wealth blinds us. So there's absolutely no question about that. So then you'd ask the question, well, why would God create a world where this is kind of the natural dynamic? Well, now we're back into preacher territory here because, well, is this what God intends? And so then what is our role? And so no, I would completely agree that there's no question. So then Bill Gates used to be a negative sermon example in terms of the amount of wealth he had. And then he completely blew it for me because the dude is getting it all away.
Right.
Which is exactly right. And so when I look at guys like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett who are taking this on, I think, yeah, how easy is it for the rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven? Well, it's like, going through the eye of a needle. And the disciples are like, well, and Jesus says, yeah, but with God, everything's possible.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Pareto distribution is something I've thought about a lot. And I until you just said it now, I'd never thought about how there's actually incentive for the rich to not let things get too unequal, because that creates unrest, which would be unbeneficial to everyone. Oh, that's so fascinating. So, okay, well, that's interesting. I think that's a good place to wrap up for the moment. We talked about like 20 different things, and I enjoyed every moment of it. So thank you for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Gret, and it's been a pleasure.
All right, take care.
All right, bye-bye.